They called him the Beast of Bitter Creek, a man so cold he rejected every beauty in the territory. Silas Hawthorne wanted a wife who could survive the winter, not just look pretty in a parlor. But when his father lies dying, rotting from a wound no doctor can cure, Silas gets desperate. He didn't expect help to come from Clara Bigsby, the woman the whole town mocked for her size. She claims she can save him with one secret ingredient, but Silas blocks the door. He laughs in her face. He has no idea that this woman is about to change his life, heal his father, and teach him that the biggest hearts often come in the unlikeliest packages. You won't believe the twist in Part 5. The sign posted outside the sheriff's office in Oak Haven, Wyoming, was weathered by the wind, but the bold black ink was still legible. It read, "Wanted a wife. Must be strong. Must be capable. Frail flowers need not apply." Silas Hawthorne. Most men in 1885 courted with flowers and awkward conversations on front porches. Silas Hawthorne courted like he was buying a mule. He was 32 years old, standing 6'4", with shoulders that strained the seams of his flannel shirts. He lived high up on the ridge at Bitter Creek, a place where the snow fell in October and didn't melt. Until May. He was rich, everyone knew that. The Hawthorne timber claim was the most lucrative in the territory. But Silas was hard. On a crisp Tuesday morning, the town square was buzzing. Silas had come down from the mountain, his massive black stallion kicking up dust. He wasn't alone. Tied to his saddle was a string of furs, and behind him trailed a wagon, driven by his father, Jedediah Hawthorne. Jedediah was the only soft thing about Silas. The old man was in his 60s, with a laugh that sounded like dry leaves rustling, but lately that laugh had gone silent. Jedediah had cut his leg on a rusted saw blade 3 weeks ago. The wound wasn't closing. Silas hitched his horse and helped his father down. The old man winced, his face grey and sweating despite the chill. "Just a scratch, Si." Jedediah wheezed, leaning heavily on a cane. "It smells like rot, Pa." Silas growled, his voice a low rumble that made passers-by step aside. "We're seeing Doc Miller, and then I'm picking a bride. I'm done waiting." News traveled fast. By the time Silas stepped out of the doctor's office, his face thunderous because Doc Miller had suggested amputation, a line of women had formed by the livery stable. They were the town's finest. There was Lydia Sterling, the mayor's daughter, cinched so tight in her corset she could barely breathe. There was Sarah Miller, the doctor's niece, frail and pale as a lily. They all wanted the Hawthorne money. They all wanted the rugged, dangerous mountain man. Silas walked down the line, his boots crunching in the dirt. He stopped in front of Lydia. She bat her eyelashes, twirling a parasol. "Can you gut a deer, Miss Sterling?" Silas asked, his blue eyes piercing. "Heavens, no." Lydia giggled. "I play the pianoforte." Silas moved to the next. "Can you chop a cord of wood before breakfast?" The girl, Sarah, looked terrified. "My hands are made for embroidery, Mr. Hawthorne." Silas scoffed a harsh sound that made the women flinch. "Useless," he muttered loud enough for everyone to hear. "I need a partner, not a pet. Up on the mountain, the wind will snap you twigs in half." He turned his back on them, rejecting the most beautiful women in Oak Haven in under 2 minutes. The town gasped. The audacity of the man. "You'll die alone up there, Silas Hawthorne." Lydia screeched, her vanity wounded. "Better alone than burdened," Silas shot back. He turned to help his father back into the wagon, his expression grim. The doctor's words were ringing in his ears. "Gangrene, Silas. If you don't cut that leg off by Friday, the infection will reach his heart. He'll be dead by Sunday." Silas felt a cold grip of fear in his chest. He couldn't lose his Pa. Pa was all he had. He needed a miracle, not a wife. But as he lifted the reins, he didn't see the pair of eyes watching him from the shadows of the general store's alleyway. They belonged to Clara Bigsby, and she wasn't looking at Silas with lust or greed. She was looking at Jedediah's leg. She smelled the infection from 20 feet away, a sweet, sickly scent she knew all too well. Clara Bigsby was 26, and in the harsh social hierarchy of Oakhaven, she was invisible, or rather, she was too visible, and therefore ignored. Clara was big. She was undeniably obese by the standards of the day, with soft, heavy curves, thick arms, and a round face that flushed pink when she exerted herself. She worked in the back of the general store, hauling sacks of flour that grown men groaned over. She was strong, stronger than anyone gave her credit for. But because her dresses were plain homespun calico and strained at the buttons, the townspeople treated her like furniture. "Did you see him?" whispered Mrs. Gable, the shop owner's wife, peering out the window as Silas rode away. Refused Lydia Sterling. The arrogance. Clara kept sweeping the floor, her head down. "He's worried about his father," she said softly. Mrs. Gable sniffed. "Jedediah is a goner. Doc Miller says it's the blood rot. Nothing stops that but the saw." Clara gripped the broom handle tighter. That's not true, she thought. The Shoshone women knew. Grandmother Bigsby knew. Clara's grandmother had been a midwife and a healer who lived on the edge of the territory. She had taught Clara the language of roots and earth before she passed. Clara knew things the town doctor with his fancy degree from Boston deemed witchery. That night a storm rolled in. Thunder shook the floorboards of the small attic room Clara rented. She couldn't sleep. She kept thinking of the grey look on Jedediah Hawthorne's face. She had always liked Jedediah. Years ago, when she was a child and crying because some boys threw rocks at her for being a fat cow, Jedediah had stopped his wagon, given her a peppermint stick, and told her, "Don't you listen, little one. Heavy logs burn the longest and hottest." It was the only kindness a man had ever shown her. By midnight the rain was lashing down. Clara made a decision. She went to her small trunk at the foot of her bed. She pulled out a leather satchel that smelled of earth and dried sage. Inside were jars of odd-coloured pastes, dried leaves, and a small sealed clay pot containing a thick black substance. The black drawing salve. It was a mixture of beeswax-activated charcoal bentonite clay and a specific dangerous herb that grew only in the deep shade of the cliffside bloodroot. It stung like fire, but it could pull infection out of a bone. "I can save him," Clara whispered to the empty room. But going to the Hawthorne claim was dangerous. It was a 3-hour ride up a steep, muddy trail. And Silas was a bear of a man who had just publicly humiliated the prettiest girls in town. What would he say to her, a woman who weighed nearly 200 pounds and had no dowry? She didn't own a horse. She had a mule, a stubborn creature named Barnaby. At 4:00 a.m., under the cover of darkness and driving rain, Clara Bigsby mounted Barnaby. She wore her thickest wool cloak, but the rain soaked her instantly. "Come on, Barnaby," she urged. The ride was a nightmare. Twice the mule slipped in the mud, nearly sending Clara tumbling into the ravine. The wind howled through the pines, sounding like wolves. By the time she reached the plateau where the Hawthorne cabin stood, the sun was trying to break through the storm clouds, but the air was freezing. The cabin was more of a fortress. Massive logs, a stone chimney smoking grey into the sky. Clara slid off the mule, her knees shaking from the strain. She was soaked, her hair plastered to her face, her dress muddy. She looked a wreck. She grabbed her satchel and marched to the heavy oak door. She pounded on it 3 times. Boom, boom, boom. Inside she heard a dog bark, and then heavy footsteps. The door swung open. Silas Hawthorne filled the frame. He was shirtless, holding a towel, having just washed up. The sight of his broad, scarred chest made Clara's breath hitch, but she forced herself to look him in the eye. Silas stared down at her. He saw a large, disheveled woman dripping wet on his porch, shivering with mud on her cheek. He didn't recognize her at first. "We ain't buying nothing," Silas grunted, starting to close the door. "I'm not selling," Clara said, her voice trembling but loud. "I'm here for Jedediah." Silas paused. He looked her up and down, his lip curling slightly. "You? Who are you, the laundress?" The insult stung, but Clara stood her ground. "I'm Clara Bigsby, and I know Doc Miller wants to take your father's leg tomorrow. I'm here to tell you he doesn't have to." Silas laughed. It was a harsh, humorless bark. "You're a doctor now, I remember you. You're the girl from the general store, the one who breaks the floorboards." He was cruel. He was lashing out because he was scared and exhausted, but the cruelty hit its mark. Clara felt tears prick her eyes, but she remembered the peppermint stick. She remembered the kindness of the father, even if the son was a brute. "You can mock my size all you want, Silas Hawthorne," Clara said, stepping forward so her chest almost bumped his. "But I have a poultice in this bag that can draw out the gangrene. I can save his leg. Or you can stand here and insult me while your father rots in the next room. Which is it going to be?" Silas stopped laughing. He looked at the determination in her hazel eyes. He looked at the heavy satchel she clutched like a shield. From the back room, a groan of agony echoed through the house. "See? Water." Silas's face fell. The arrogance vanished, replaced by pure, raw panic. He looked back at Clara. "If you're lying," Silas whispered, his voice dropping to a lethal growl, "if you hurt him more, I will throw you off this mountain myself." "I'm not lying," Clara said. Silas stepped back and swung the door wide. "Get in." The inside of the Hawthorne cabin was stiflingly hot. A massive fire roared in the hearth, but the air was heavy with the copper tang of blood and the sweet, cloying scent of decay. Clara didn't waste a second. She dropped her wet cloak on the floorboards, revealing her plain brown dress that clung damply to her heavy frame. She marched past Silas, her boots thudding with purpose. "Boil water," she commanded, not looking back. "Lots of it. And I need clean linen strips. If you don't have linen, tear up your best cotton shirts. I don't care which." Silas blinked, stunned by her tone. No one ordered him around, certainly not in his own home. But the urgency in her voice mobilized him. He grabbed a kettle and filled it from the water barrel, slamming it onto the hook over the fire. Clara knelt beside the bed in the corner. Jedediah was pale as a sheet, his breathing shallow and rattling in his chest. His leg was propped up on a pillow covered by a stained quilt. "Mr. Hawthorne," Clara whispered, placing a cool hand on his fevered forehead. "It's Clara. I'm going to help you." Jedediah's eyes fluttered open, glassy and unfocused. "Angel," he rasped. "Not quite," she murmured. With gentle, steady hands, she peeled back the quilt. Even Clara, who had seen farm accidents and hunting wounds, had to suppress a gasp. The leg was angry, swollen to twice its size, the skin tight and shiny. Red streaks shot up from the calf toward the knee like lightning bolts of poison. But the wound itself, just above the ankle, was black and oozing. "It's moved fast," Silas said. He was standing right behind her, his voice tight. "Doc said it's in the blood." "It is," Clara said, opening her satchel. "But the heart of it is still in the wound. The doctors seal it up, thinking it will heal. But the poison is trapped. We have to draw it out." She pulled out the clay pot of black drawing salve. She uncorked it, and a pungent, earthy smell filled the room. Tar pine and something sharp like vinegar. "This is going to hurt him, Silas," Clara said, using his first name without thinking. She turned to look up at the looming mountain man. "When I put this on, It will feel like a branding iron. He will fight. You have to hold him down." Silas looked at the black paste, then at his father. "If he dies from the shock, he will die from the rot by sunrise if we do nothing," Clara countered. "Do you trust your strength?" Silas set his jaw. "I trust nothing else." "Then hold him." Silas moved to the head of the bed, pinning his father's shoulders to the mattress with his massive hands. Clara took a deep breath. She scooped a generous amount of the thick black salve onto a wooden spatula and slathered it directly into the open, rotting wound. For a second, nothing happened. Then Jedediah Hawthorne screamed. It was a sound of pure animal agony. The old man's back arched off the bed, his eyes rolling back in his head. "Pa! I got you, Pa!" Silas roared, struggling to keep his father from thrashing. "Stop it! You're killing him!" Silas looked at Clara with wild, murderous eyes. "Take it off. He can't take it." "Don't you let go!" Clara shouted back, her voice booming with an authority that shook the rafters. She didn't flinch. She grabbed the linen strips and began wrapping the leg tightly, sealing the burning salve against the flesh. "The pain means the nerves are still alive. It means the body is fighting. Hold him, Silas." Clara was sweating now, her hair falling from its pins, sticking to her flushed cheeks. She used her own body weight to hold Jedediah's leg steady as she bound it. She was heavy, solid, an anchor in the storm of the old man's pain. For 10 agonizing minutes, the cabin was filled with Jedediah's cries and Silas's tortured reassurances. Finally, the old man's thrashing slowed. He went limp, falling into a deep, unconscious swoon. Silas let go, his chest heaving. He looked drained, his face pale beneath his beard. He looked at his father's still form, then slowly turned his gaze to Clara. She was trembling now. The adrenaline was fading, leaving her exhausted. She wiped her hands on her apron, leaving a streak of black charcoal on the fabric. "Is he?" Silas asked, his voice cracking. "He's alive," Clara said softly. "The salve is working. It draws the infection to the surface. Now we wait. The fever has to break before dawn." Silas stared at her. He looked at her hands, which were shaking. He looked at her wet dress, the mud on her hem, the way her chest rose and fell. For the first time, he didn't see a fat girl. He saw a warrior who had just gone to battle with death itself. "You better sit down," Silas grunted, pointing to the hearth. "Before you fall down." The storm outside intensified sleet, hammering against the roof like handfuls of gravel. Inside, the only light came from the fireplace, casting long, dancing shadows on the log walls. Clara sat on a wooden stool near the fire, shivering. Now that the work was done, the cold from her ride had settled deep in her bones. She hugged her arms around her chest, trying to stop her teeth from chattering. Silas was pacing. He checked his father every 5 minutes, touching the old man's forehead, then pacing again. Finally, he stopped and looked at Clara. He realized she was freezing. Without a word, Silas walked to a chest at the foot of his own bunk. He pulled out a thick red flannel shirt and a pair of wool socks. He tossed them into her lap. "Put those on," he said roughly. "Your lips are blue. I don't need 2 corpses in here." Clara looked at the shirt. It was enormous. "Thank you," she whispered. "I'll turn my back," Silas said. He walked to the window, staring out into the blackness of the storm. Clara quickly peeled off her wet bodice and slipped into Silas's flannel shirt. It smelled of him, cedar tobacco and rain. It was warm and swallowed her frame, hanging down to her knees. She pulled the dry socks onto her feet and sat back down, feeling the warmth begin to return. "You can turn around," she said. Silas turned. He poured a cup of coffee from the pot on the fire and handed it to her. It was black and bitter, but it was the best thing she had ever tasted. He pulled a chair opposite her and sat down, leaning his elbows on his knees. The firelight flickered in his blue eyes. "Why?" he asked. The word hung in the air. Clara blew on her coffee. "Why what? Why did you come?" Silas studied her face. "I humiliated the women of this town today. I've been a bastard to everyone since Pa got sick. I called you names, and yet you rode a mule up a mountain in a thunderstorm to save a man you barely know. Why?" Clara looked into the fire. She swirled the dark liquid in her cup. "I don't barely know him," she said softly. 15 years ago, I was 11. I was big for my age. Even then, some boys cornered me behind the livery. They were throwing rocks, calling me a sow." Silas's jaw tightened, a muscle feathering in his cheek. "I was crying," Clara continued. "Your father came by in his wagon. He didn't just drive past. He stopped. He got down, chased those boys off with a whip. Then he gave me a peppermint stick and told me that heavy logs burn the longest and hottest. He told me I had value." She looked up at Silas, her hazel eyes clear and honest. "People in Oakhaven don't look at me, Silas. They look through me, or they look at me with disgust. Your father was the first man to look at me with kindness. I couldn't let him die if I had a way to stop it." Silas was silent for a long time. He looked at the floorboards. A strange emotion was twisting in his gut. Shame. He had judged this woman just like the others. He had dismissed her because she didn't fit the shape of a wife he had pictured in his head. "I'm sorry," Silas said. The words were low, almost a growl, as if he wasn't used to using them. "For what I said at the door." Clara offered a small, tired smile. "You were scared. Fear makes wolves of us all." "You're not a wolf," Silas said, looking at her intently. "You're something else." He stood up and went to the pantry. He came back with a plate of cold biscuits and dried venison. "Eat. You'll need your strength for the morning." They ate in silence, a companionable quiet settling between them. The animosity had evaporated, replaced by a shared vigil. Every hour, Clara checked the leg. The smell of rot was lessening, replaced by the smell of the herbs. Around 400 a.m., the wind died down. The cabin went still. Clara had dozed off in the chair, her head lolling to the side. Silas watched her sleep. In the firelight, with her hair loose and his shirt encompassing her, she looked soft, vulnerable. He felt a sudden, fierce urge to put a blanket over her. He stood up to do just that when a sound from the bed stopped him. Silas rushed to the bed. Jedediah was awake. His eyes were clear. "Pa!" Silas fell to his knees. "Thirsty," Jedediah whispered. Silas grabbed the water dipper and held it to his father's lips. Jedediah drank greedily. Silas touched his father's forehead. It was cool. The fever had broken. "Thank God," Silas breathed, burying his face in the mattress. Clara woke with a start. What is it?" "The fever is gone," Silas said, turning to her. His face was transformed by relief, a grin breaking through his beard that made him look 10 years younger. "He's cool, Clara. He's cool." Clara hurried over, checking the pulse. It was stronger. "We did it," she whispered, a smile lighting up her face. "The worst is over." For a moment, in the euphoria of the victory, Silas reached out and grabbed Clara's hand. His grip was strong, calloused and warm. He squeezed her hand tight. "You did it," he said intensely. "You saved him." Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, not from fear, but from the electric touch of his skin on hers. She looked down at their joined hands, his large and scarred, hers soft and plump. They fit together surprisingly well, but the moment was shattered by the sound of horses whinnying outside. Heavy boots stomped onto the porch. The door flew open without a knock. Doc Miller stood there, flanked by the town sheriff and 2 deputies. The doctor was holding a leather case that contained his bone saws. "Step aside, Hawthorne," Doc Miller announced, shaking rain from his coat. "I told you I'd be here Friday morning. If we don't take that leg now, he's a dead man. Sheriff, hold Silas back if he struggles." Silas stood up, releasing Clara's hand. His face went dark, the beast of Bitter Creek returning in an instant. "You ain't touching him," Silas growled, stepping between the men and the bed. "Don't be a fool, Silas," the sheriff warned, hand resting on his pistol. "Doc says it's the only way. We're doing this for his own good. He doesn't need the saw." Clara stepped forward, placing herself next to Silas. Doc Miller squinted at her. "Clara Bigsby. What in God's name are you doing up here?" He looked at the black pot on the table and sneered. "Don't tell me you've been using that witch mud on him. You'll give him blood poisoning, girl." "He's better," Clara insisted. "The fever broke." "Impossible," Doc Miller scoffed, pushing past her. "Gangrene doesn't just break. It eats. Now move, or the sheriff will move you." Silas reached for the rifle, leaning against the fireplace. The sheriff drew his gun. The cabin air was thick enough to choke on. The only sound was the hiss of the fire and the steady drip of rain outside. "Lower your weapon, Silas," Sheriff Brody said, his voice tight. "I don't want to shoot you." "Then get that butcher out of my house," Silas snarled, the rifle stock pressed firmly against his shoulder, his finger hovering over the trigger. His eyes were fixed on Doc Miller, blue ice against the doctor's sweaty pallor. "It's the law, Hawthorne," Doc Miller insisted, though he took a step behind the nearest deputy. "The man is a public health risk. The gangrene will spread. He's delirious. That girl is feeding you lies. He is not delirious." Clara's voice cut through the tension, sharp as an axe blade. She did the unthinkable. She stepped right into the line of fire, placing her ample body directly between Silas's rifle and the sheriff's pistol. "Clara, move!" Silas barked, terrified. A twitch of a finger would end her. "No!" Clara stood firm, her chest heaving beneath Silas's oversized red flannel shirt. She looked the sheriff dead in the eye. "Sheriff Brody, you've known me my whole life. You know I don't lie. You're about to let this man saw off a good man's leg for no reason. Look at the patient. That's all I ask. If it's rotting, I'll step aside." The sheriff hesitated. He looked at Clara's fierce determination, then at the nervous shifting of the doctor. "All right. One look. Silas, keep that rifle pointed at the floor." Silas slowly lowered the barrel inches, but his grip didn't loosen. Clara marched to the bed. Doc Miller tried to intercept her. "Don't touch those bandages, you stupid girl. You'll release the miasma." Clara ignored him. With steady hands, she began to unwrap the linen strips she had applied hours before. The outer layers were stained dark with the charcoal paste. As she peeled back the final layers, the pungent smell of pine and herbs filled the room, overpowering the earlier scent of decay. She pulled the last cloth away. A collective gasp filled the room. The leg was not black. It was not swollen to bursting. The angry red streaks running up toward the knee had faded to pale pink lines. The wound itself, though still ugly and open, was clean. The dead black flesh was gone, drawn out into the paste, leaving behind raw red meat that was already showing signs of granulation, new healing tissue. "Dear God," whispered a deputy. Sheriff Brody holstered his gun. He walked over and peered closely at the leg. He touched Jedediah's foot. It was warm. "Doc, this leg is healing." Doc Miller's face went from pale to a mottled purple hue of rage. He didn't look relieved that his patient was saved. He looked cornered. "It's a trick of the light," Miller sputtered, sweat dripping off his nose. "It's temporary. The bone is still infected. Give me the saw, I have to finish this." He lunged toward his leather bag on the table, grabbing the handle of the bone saw with manic desperation. Silas moved faster than a striking rattlesnake. He dropped the rifle and slammed Doc Miller against the log wall. his forearm pressing against the doctor's throat, pinning him inches off the floor. "Why are you so desperate to cut him?" "Miller," Silas growled, his face inches from the doctor's. "You saw the leg. A blind man could see its healing. Why did you want him crippled or dead?" "Get off me, you barbarian," Miller wheezed. In the scuffle, Miller's medical bag had been knocked to the floor, spilling its contents. Glass vials rolled across the puncheon floorboards. One vial didn't roll like the others. It was wrapped tightly in oilcloth hidden at the bottom. Clara bent down and picked it up. She unwrapped the cloth. It wasn't medicine. It was a small, dark bottle with no label, smelling faintly of bitter almonds and something foul. "What is this, doctor?" Clara asked, holding it up. Her grandmother had taught her about poisons, too. "This smells like concentrated arsenic and rotten meat essence. Why would a healer carry death in his bag?" The room went deathly silent. The sheriff stared at the bottle in Clara's hand, then at the doctor, pinned to the wall. "Talk, Miller," Sheriff Brody said, his voice low and dangerous, "before I let Silas loose on you." Under the crushing pressure of Silas's arm, Doc Miller broke. "It wasn't my idea," Miller squealed, his eyes darting around the room. "It was Mayor Sterling. He holds my debts from the gambling tables in St. Louis. He said if Jedediah died, you'd break Silas. You'd sell the timber rights cheap, just to get away from this mountain. The mayor has buyers lined up from the railroad. He promised to wipe my slate clean." Silas roared a sound of pure fury and drew back his fist. "Silas, no!" Clara shouted. "Don't kill him. He's not worth hanging for." Silas froze, his fist trembling in the air. He looked at Clara, standing there in the firelight, holding the evidence of the betrayal. Her eyes begged him to be better than the beast everyone thought he was. With a snarl of disgust, Silas released the doctor, letting him slump to the floor in a pathetic heap. "Get him out of here, Sheriff," Silas said, his voice like grinding stones, "before I change my mind." The sheriff cuffed Doc Miller and hauled him to his feet. "You're done in Oakhaven, Miller. We'll be having a long talk with Mayor Sterling, too." The deputies gathered the gear, looking at Silas with newfound respect, and at Clara with awe. As the door closed behind them, silence returned to the cabin on Bitter Creek. But the air felt different now. It was cleaner. The departure of the lawmen left a vibrating quiet in the cabin. The danger was past, the conspiracy shattered, and all that was left was the exhaustion of the long night. Silas stood by the door, staring at the wood grain, his back to the room. His shoulders, usually so rigid, were slumped. The revelation that the town doctor and mayor had conspired to murder his father for timber money had shaken his foundation. He turned slowly. His eyes first went to Jedediah, sleeping soundly, a peaceful look on his face that hadn't been there in weeks. Then his gaze moved to Clara. She was sitting back on the stool by the fire, looking utterly depleted. Her hair was a tangled mess around her shoulders, her face smudged with soot and sweat, and she was still drowning in his red flannel shirt. Silas Hawthorne had never seen anything so beautiful in his entire life. He walked toward her, his heavy boots quiet on the floorboards. He stopped a few feet away, towering over her, but for the first time, he felt small. "Clara," he said. His voice was rough, unused to gentleness. She looked up, her hazel eyes, tired but wary. "Silas." He struggled for the words. How does a man apologize for being a blind fool? How does he thank someone for giving him back his world? He slowly lowered himself onto one knee in front of her, bringing himself down to her eye level. It was a humbling posture for the mountain man of Bitter Creek. "I judged you," he said quietly, looking directly into her eyes. "I judged you the moment I saw you in town, and I judged you when you came to my door. I thought strength looked like muscles and axes. I thought value looked like a thin waist and a pretty face. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and gently took her hands in his. They were rough, reddened from the hot water and hard work of the night. "You are the strongest person I have ever met, Clara Bigsby," he murmured. "You rode through hell to save a man who showed you kindness once. You stood down guns. You uncovered a viper's nest." He squeezed her hands lightly. "You saved my father's life. And I think you might have saved mine tonight too, when you stopped me from beating Miller to death." Clara felt a blush heat her neck and cheeks hotter than the fire. No one had ever spoken to her like this. No man had ever knelt before her, except in mockery. "You would have done the same for your pa," she whispered, finding it hard to breathe with him so close, his blue eyes so intense. "No." Silas shook his head. "I wouldn't have had the courage to try the old ways. I would have let Miller cut him. I was scared." "You weren't." He stood up, pulling her gently to her feet. She stumbled slightly, her legs stiff, and he caught her, his hands steady on her waist. The contact sent a jolt through both of them. He didn't let go immediately. He felt the solid warmth of her, the soft curves beneath the thick flannel. It didn't feel burdensome. It felt substantial. It felt real. He stepped back, clearing his throat, suddenly shy. "You can't go back down the mountain today. The trail is washed out. Barnaby would break a leg." "I have to get back to the store," Clara said feebly, though the thought of the ride made her shudder. "To hell with the store." Silas growled, a flash of his old self appearing. "You think Mrs. Gable deserves you hauling her flour sacks after what you did here?" He walked over to the mantelpiece where a folded piece of paper lay. It was one of his wanted signs. He snatched it up and crumpled it in his massive fist, tossing it into the fire. It flared up and turned to ash. He turned back to her. "The position is still open, Clara, but the requirements have changed." Clara's heart stopped. "What do you mean?" Silas crossed the room again, stopping inches from her. The intensity of his gaze pinned her to the spot. "I don't want a frail flower, and I don't just want a strong back to chop wood." His voice dropped, becoming husky. "I want a partner, someone who knows fire and earth, someone who can stand up to me when I'm wrong and stand beside me when the wolves come. I want the woman who walked through a storm for an old man." He reached up and brushed a stray lock of hair from her cheek, his knuckles grazing her skin. The touch was incredibly tender for such a large man. "Stay, Clara. Marry me. Not because I'm desperate, but because I think I might go crazy if you leave." The silence in the cabin was heavier than the timber logs that held up the roof. Outside, the last weeping drops of the storm tapped against the glass, but inside the air crackled with a tension that was terrifying and electric. Silas's proposal hung between them. "Marry me." Clara looked at the man kneeling before her. For 26 years, she had been the invisible girl of Oakhaven. She was the big girl, the one people made jokes about behind their hands, the one assumed to be jolly because she was heavy, yet who went home to cry into her pillow. She had resigned herself to a life of solitude, finding comfort in her herbs and her books. Now the most powerful, feared man in the territory was on one knee, looking at her, as if she were the sun breaking over the ridge. "You don't have to answer now," Silas added quickly, a rare flicker of insecurity cracking his stone facade. He pulled back slightly, his large hands hovering near hers. "I know I'm not a prize. I'm rough. I've lived alone too long. I've got a temper that scares wolves off." Clara finally found her voice. It started as a whisper, but grew stronger, fueled by the fire in her blood. She stepped closer, closing the gap he had created. She reached out and took his large, calloused hand, a hand that had chopped forests and crushed men, and placed it flat against her chest, right over her pounding heart. "Silas," she said, her voice trembling, not with fear, but with emotion. "I've spent my whole life being told I take up too much space, that I'm too loud, too big, too much for a polite society. You're the first man who ever looked at me and didn't try to look around me." She squeezed his hand, feeling the rough skin against her palm. "But I need to know something. Are you asking because I saved your father? Because if this is a debt payment, Silas Hawthorne, I will walk out that door and never come back." Silas's eyes darkened, turning a shade of midnight blue. He stood up slowly, unfolding his massive frame until he towered over her. But he didn't pull away. Instead, he brought his other hand up to cup her face, his thumb tracing the curve of her jaw with a tenderness that belied his size. "Gratitude is for a dog that barks at a stranger." Silas rumbled, the sound vibrating in his chest. "This isn't gratitude, Clara. When I saw you stand in front of that gun defying the sheriff to save a man who couldn't save himself, I didn't see a nurse. I saw my equal." He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers, sharing the same breath. "I judged you on the street because I was a blind fool. But up here, in the firelight, I see the only woman in Wyoming with a spine strong enough to match mine. I'm asking because I want to wake up next to you every morning. I want to know that when the winter comes, I'm not freezing alone." Clara closed her eyes, letting the tears finally fall. They weren't tears of sadness, but of a lifetime of rejection washing away. "Then the answer is yes." Silas didn't waste another second. He kissed her. It wasn't a tentative, polite courtship kiss. It was possessive, and deeper claim staked on her soul. He pulled her flush against him, his arms wrapping around her waist, making her feel small for the first time in her life. She melted into him, her hands tangling in his hair, the scent of pine and rain overwhelming her senses. From the bed in the corner, a raspy, weak chuckle broke the heavy mood. "About time," Jedediah croaked, grinning weakly from his pillows. "I thought I'd have to get up and knock your heads together myself." 3 days later, the mountain air was crisp and smelling of wet earth and renewal. The trail had dried enough for travel. Silas hitched the wagon, preparing a nest of furs in the back for Jedediah. The old man was weak, but the color had returned to his cheeks, and the leg was healing with miraculous speed. They were taking him down to the county seat to see a surgeon Silas actually trusted, one who wouldn't be bribed by the mayor. Clara packed her satchel and walked toward Barnaby, her stubborn mule. She reached for the saddle horn, but a large hand clamped over hers. "No," Silas said firmly. Clara looked up, confused. "Silas, I have to ride. The wagon is full with your pa." "You're not riding the mule," Silas stated, as if it were a law of physics. He whistled, and Shadow, his massive black stallion, a beast 17 hands high that terrified most grown men, trotted over. "Silas, that horse is a monster." Clara laughed nervously. "He'll throw me before I get a foot in the stirrup." "He won't," Silas said, "because I'll be right behind you." Effortlessly, as if she weighed nothing more than a sack of feathers, Silas lifted Clara by the waist. She gasped as she was hoisted into the air and settled onto the high leather saddle. Before she could adjust, Silas swung up behind her. His chest pressed against her back, a solid wall of warmth. His arms came around her to take the reins effectively, caging her within his embrace. "My wife," Silas whispered in her ear, his beard brushing her neck. "Does not trail behind like a servant. We ride together, or we don't ride at all." The journey down the mountain was a revelation. Clara had ridden up in the dark, battered by rain and fear. Now she descended in the golden afternoon light, wrapped in the arms of the man she loved, viewing the world from the height of a queen. They reached Oakhaven just as the noon work whistle blew. The streets were crowded. When the Hawthorne procession entered the main thoroughfare, silence rippled through the crowd like a wave. They expected a hearse. They expected a grieving son. Instead, they saw Jedediah, sitting up in the wagon, waving his cane at the stunned onlookers. But the sight that made jaws drop was the lead horse. Silas Hawthorne, the beast of Bitter Creek, rode tall and proud, and sitting between his arms, head held high, was Clara Bigsby. He wasn't hiding her. He was parading her. They rode straight to the general store. Silas pulled the stallion up the horse's hooves, clattering on the boardwalk. He dismounted first, then turned and lifted Clara down with a deliberate, lingering slowness that made several church ladies fan themselves. He kept his arm securely around her waist, pulling her into his side as they walked through the double doors. The bell jingled. The store was busy. Mrs. Gable looked up from the counter, her glasses sliding down her nose. Lydia Sterling was there too, holding court with her friends, selecting ribbons. The chatter died instantly. Clara. Mrs. Gable blinked, looking at the red flannel shirt Clara was still wearing, tucked into her skirt, and the men's boots on her feet. "You're 3 days late for work. I've already docked your pay for the week. Grab a broom, there's mud on the porch." "She quits," Silas announced, his voice booming off the rafters, startling a cat sleeping on a barrel. Lydia Sterling scoffed, snapping her parasol shut. She turned her eyes, scanning Clara with undisguised disgust. "Quits and go where?" Lydia let out a cruel, tinkling laugh. "The poor thing probably got lost in the storm, and Mr. Hawthorne took pity on the stray. It was very Christian of you, Silas, to rescue the help. But really you shouldn't let her touch the merchandise with those dirty hands." Silas released Clara and took a step toward Lydia. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees. "She isn't the help," Silas said, his voice quiet, deadly, and ringing with authority. "And she didn't get lost. She rode up the mountain in a gale to save my father when your town doctor and your father the mayor tried to kill him for timber rights." Gasps erupted from the customers. Lydia paled, taking a step back. "And," Silas continued, stepping back to pull Clara tighter against his side, his hand resting possessively on her hip. "She is the future Mrs. Silas Hawthorne. We're marrying on Sunday." Lydia dropped her spool of ribbon. Mrs. Gable's mouth fell open, resembling a landed fish. "Her," Lydia shrieked, her composure cracking under the shock. "You refused me. For her, Silas, look at her. She's a cow. She's fat and plain and poor." The insult hung in the air, ugly, sharp, and familiar. It was the same word that had made Clara cry when she was 11. But Clara wasn't 11 anymore, and she wasn't alone. Silas roared, his fists clenching, but Clara placed a hand on his chest to stop him. "I can do this," her eyes told him. Clara stepped forward. She didn't look down. She didn't shrink. She looked Lydia Sterling in the eye. "Yes?" Clara said calmly, her voice projecting to the back of the store. "I am big. I take up space. But my hands healed a man your vanity would have let die. My heart was strong enough to brave a storm while you sat by the fire." She smiled, a genuine, pitying smile that infuriated Lydia more than any shout could. "You have your ribbons, Lydia. You have your waistline. But I have the mountain, and I have the man." Silas grinned, a look of pure, predatory pride. He reached into his coat and slammed a heavy leather bag of gold coins onto the counter. The thud echoed like a gunshot. "Mrs. Gable," Silas commanded, "I want your finest silk. 3 bolts, the blue that matches her eyes, and new boots, and a winter coat lined with fox fur. The best you have. My bride needs a trousseau." He looked around the shop, his gaze challenging every man and woman present. "And if anyone in this town speaks a disrespectful word to her again, you answer to me. And the sheriff knows exactly what the mayor did. I'd suggest you all choose your sides carefully." He turned to Clara, his expression softening instantly as he offered her his arm. "Ready, my love?" Clara took it, her chin lifted, radiating a beauty that had nothing to do with size. "Ready, Silas." The wedding had been small, held in the meadow behind the cabin, with the wild flowers blooming in a riot of purple and yellow. Jedediah, walking with a cane but moving well, had given the bride away, weeping openly with joy. Life on the mountain was hard, but Clara thrived in it. She wasn't just the wife, she was the heart of the home. Her garden grew thick with vegetables and healing herbs that she now sold to the townspeople who came up the mountain with hat in hand, respectful and apologetic. One evening Silas came in from the timberline, shaking sawdust from his coat. The cabin, once stark and cold, was now filled with warmth, the smell of baking bread and the sound of humming. He washed up at the basin and came to sit by the fire where Clara was mending a quilt. He watched her for a moment, the firelight dancing on her face, highlighting the flush in her cheeks. "What are you thinking about?" Clara asked, looking up and catching his stare. Silas reached out and pulled her onto his lap, his arms wrapping around her, resting his large hand gently on her stomach, which was just beginning to show the round curve of their first child. "I was thinking," Silas said, softly nuzzling into her hair, "that for years I thought I was the richest man in the territory, because of the timber. I thought gold was what made a man wealthy." He kissed her cheek, a content sigh escaping him. "I was wrong," he whispered. "I didn't know what rich was, until the storm blew you to my door." Clara smiled, leaning back into his solid strength, watching the fire dance. The town below could keep their gossip and their corsets. Up here on the ridge, Clara Bigsby had found her kingdom, and the beast of Bitter Creek had finally found his heart. And that is the incredible story of how Clara Bigsby, the woman the world overlooked, became the queen of Bitter Creek. She proved that true worth isn't found in a mirror, but in the strength of your spirit and the courage to act when others won't. Silas Hawthorne thought he wanted a worker, but he found a warrior. What did you think of the doctor's betrayal? And would you have forgiven the townspeople like Clara did, or would you have made them pay? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of romance, justice, and redemption, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Don't forget to share this video with someone who needs a reminder that they are worthy of love, and subscribe, and ring the bell so you never miss a new story. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.